Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session, Monday, July 3rd, 2023. Today, I am very pleased to welcome Morgan Irons. She is a soil and crop sciences PhD candidate in the Lehman Lab at Cornell University, where her research focuses on microbial adhesion mechanisms and organo-mineral organo-organic interactions in soil aggregates and their effects on soil organic carbon persistence under Earth gravity and varying gravity conditions. Irons is also co-founder and chief science officer of Deep Space Ecology, an agriculture and space business startup working on the challenges of food insecurity and human sustainability in the deep spaces of Earth, the Moon, Mars, and beyond. I would like to give a very warm welcome to Morgan Irons. You have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. Just confirming that the slides are visible.
Looks perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, so just as Nicole said, I am a soil and crop scientist. I am also an astroecologist. So a lot of my work looks at this intersection of the Earth agricultural industry and the space agricultural industry. And so when I was thinking about what to give my talk on, my thoughts went to key environmental principles at the intersection of Earth and space agriculture. And so that's what I would like to focus on today. But first, we have been hearing a lot in the media about space agriculture and what does that look like. So you may recognize a few of these images from Doctor Who, The Expanse, movies like The Passengers and The Martian, as well as various artworks that have been created by people to depict what space agriculture could look like. But this idea of space agriculture didn't start with the Martian movie in 2015. There's actually this amazing history of closed ecological system research for space habitation that goes all the way back to the 1800s and even further back if we're talking about just understanding that plants produce oxygen and that's part of our life support here on Earth. So there's this history of understanding how humans achieve life support and then how that can be translated into space. And just to show a few examples of these closed ecological systems over time, we have the BIOS experiments from the 1960s, 1970s that was done by Soviet Union scientists at the time. Then you can see this continues on. It's very much been an international effort with Europe, the United States, Russia, Japan. There have been many countries that have been working in this space, and we see other examples with the biomass production chamber, which was the first vertical farming system in the United States, or at least on an industrial scale. So this idea of vertical farming really started with NASA and then translated it back into the Earth agricultural industry, which is really cool. And then the Melissa pilot plant, which is part of the European Space Agency. And then we get into the 90s and the early 2000s, and we have projects like Biosphere 2. We have challenges start to pop up with calls for proposals on how can we improve water circulation systems in space? How can we better develop agricultural food security in space? And so there's been all that history with closed ecological systems. And then we've also had this history of plant research in space, where we need to actually understand how do plants function in environments that have varying degrees of gravity? What does this look like in different growth systems? And so as you can see, again, this isn't a comprehensive list. There's definitely a lot more research that has been done in this area. So I encourage you all to look into this research in your own time, as well as talk with your teachers about it as well. So these experiments have been actively happening in space for a few decades now. And you can see this list of plant growth systems that have occurred in space, with the most recent systems being the veggie system and the advanced plant habitat, and we see those pictured here. So we have quite a decent history of looking at closed ecological systems for space habitation, growing plants in space, understanding how the space environment affects plants. But we also have locations here on Earth where people do simulated experiments or look at different things like how can we detect signatures of past life on other planets? So this gets into this idea of origin of life astrobiology, where, well, a lot of the technology and censored information that we get to look for those signs of life on Mars or further out starts off with looking at locations here on Earth where we could detect past life. And then, of course, there's extreme environments here on Earth as well that can be helpful to understand the extreme environments of space. For example, in the Negev Desert, which is in the Middle East, there's actually this ancient civilization called the Nabatean civilization. And you might recognize the building, like their capital city was the city of Petra, where they carved these beautiful buildings into the rock faces in the desert. But in this extreme environment, at their peak of their civilization, they were able to support 30,000 people with the agricultural systems they developed in the desert. So just thinking about when we're looking towards having agricultural systems out in space, we need to remember that we have thousands of years of agricultural history here on Earth, especially with people living in extreme environments like the Nabateans, that we can look back on and draw data and information and practices from in a very respectful way, understanding where these practices come from and who developed them, and use them to understand how we can achieve agriculture, food security in the extreme environment of space. And so there's definitely this hype, there's excitement around better understanding how we can achieve agriculture in space. NASA and the Canadian Space Agency recently had their Deep Space Food Challenge, where they had United States as well as international teams participate in developing different aspects of an agricultural system in space. And I was very honored to be one of the expert judges on this project and actually help with some of the ideation of the challenge before it actually got released to the public. So there's definitely excitement in this, and for you all to participate in this challenge just shows that this challenge is not only for people who are in their career and are working for NASA or working for other companies, but it's also for students as well, because a lot of the creativity and innovation that we need from people from different backgrounds, people at different educational levels, people who have a passion for this area of research and development. And so one of the first things that I tell people to consider when we're thinking about how to develop a habitation system on another planet is look at the life support system functional objectives that NASA has put out. So these objectives are maintain closed loop atmospheric composition with optimal parameters, manage closed loop water recycling and storage, produce and store food to meet crew caloric and nutrition needs, manage and recycle waste, generate efficient energy for the system, and ensure crew safety. And I would like to add that another functional objective that should be added to this list is this idea of in situ resource utilization, which means that if you have access to a planetary surface, think about what resources are around you that can be pulled into the system to support the function and sustainability of your system. So thinking about these functional objectives, it kind of begs the question of how closed must a life support system be to meet system functional objectives? Can you completely close off your system and it functions very well 100%? Or do you need supply chains to bring resources in to restock, to help stabilize the system? Or can you have a combination of the two, where you pull resources from your local in situ resources, but then sometimes you need supply chain to come in to supplement those. So we need to think about these functional objectives, and we need to think about how closed can our system be, or will it have to rely on pulling resources from outside of it, whether through supply chains or through localized resources in the area that your habitation system is. And to give a case study of how challenging meeting these functional objectives can be, let's think about the International Space Station. So the International Space Station has environmental control and life support systems. So they have, of course, their atmospheric systems, they have wastewater recycling, they have water cycling as well. But when we put them next to the functional objectives, they only meet 4 of those objectives. And even then, it's not 100%. For example, for their wastewater recycling, they're only able to recover, I believe, 85% of their water from that system. The rest of it has to be ejected into space. So even with these systems in place on the International Space Station, there's still areas for improvement to help close off the system, but then they also can't fully grow their own food on station. So they continuously rely on supply chain to bring food onto station. They do, of course, grow plants through the veggie system, the advanced plant habitat, but a lot of that is focused more on the science research side of things, with opportunities for taste testing and things like that. But the International Space Station still very much relies on supply chains from Earth to support its functional objectives. And then, of course, it's out in low Earth orbit, so it doesn't have direct in situ resource utilization, but it still relies on the planetary surface of Earth, so there's still that to consider. But you can see how complicated this can get with trying to meet all these functional objectives, depending on where your system is and how you develop the system. And so when we're thinking about how to meet all these functional objectives, I have some key environmental principles that come to mind that are at this intersection of Earth and space agriculture. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be talking about ecological services, biogeochemical cycles, energetics, circular economy, biodiversity, and food security. So ecological services pretty much describes all of the services that are provided to us from Earth. So the multitude of resources and processes that ecosystems supply to humans. And the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, which kind of created this concept of ecological services, defines 4 types of services: supporting services, regulating services, provisioning services, and cultural services. So let's think about these services like a triangle, where the bottom of the triangle is your foundation. It holds up all the other layers of the triangle. So at the base of your triangle, the foundation of your ecological system is what we have are supporting services. And supporting services include photosynthesis, soil creation, biodiversity, nutrient cycling, biogeochemical cycles, etc. Pretty much supporting services support the ecological system, and without them, the ecosystems that we have here on Earth would not function. They would not be possible. We need photosynthesis to occur to have plants, because the majority of our plants, at least here on the surface of our planet, require photosynthesis to create the carbohydrates they need for food. We need soil formation because, as we see outside, the majority of our plants grow out of soil-based systems. Sometimes we have mosses and algae that can grow on the tops of rocks, but even those rocks will eventually break down to be soil. So soil creation is also very important. And when we think about our agricultural system, 95% of the food we consume and that is used here on Earth comes from the soil. So we rely heavily on soil for our agricultural system. So that's something important to think about when you're thinking about how are you going to develop your agriculture system? Is it going to be a soil-based field system? Is it going to be a hydroponics, aeroponics, other kind of engineered growth system? Or are you going to do an integrated system of what I like to call a field ponics system, that you have certain plants growing in the field and certain plants growing in a hydroponics or other ponics system so that they can support each other and allow for a broader biodiversity of species. So these are your supporting services that you really need to think about when you're thinking about the stability and sustainability of your agricultural system. And then above supporting services, we have regulating services. And so what regulating services do is they take the materials and the energy and the systems that come out of supporting services and regulate them throughout the ecosystem. So this includes pollination. So you have plants that are able to survive because photosynthesis is possible. And then pollination allows for the propagation of these plants. And so pollination regulates the presence and continuation of plants. Decomposition. So plants that die and other organic matter that dies, it is decomposed and re-enters the soil and becomes part of nutrients. And so decomposition is regulating the nutrient cycle. Carbon storage, climate regulation, we need rain, we need certain temperatures, we need certain weather to be able to support our ecological systems. And of course, water purification, etc. So again, regulating services are just taking all of the resources, energy, materials in our ecosystems and regulating them throughout so that we can have functional systems. And then above that, we have provisioning services. And the way to think about provisioning services is they're a product that comes out of the ecosystem that is supported by supporting services, that is regulated by regulating services. So to go back to the photosynthesis pollination example, photosynthesis in supporting services allows plants to survive and function in our ecosystem. And then pollination allows for the propagation of those plants so that we can have a bunch of plants to harvest. And then when we harvest those plants, say we harvest a corn plant, then that corn can be used as food for humans. And so food is a provisioning service, water, fuel, timber, medicines, other materials, etc. So provisioning services are only made possible because our ecosystems are present and our ecosystems are supported and regulated efficiently within our Earth system. So when we think about developing a habitation system on another planet, we need to think about, can the system that we've developed, does it meet the supporting services and regulating services to be able to produce these provisional services? Are we able to get not only food from this, but can we get clean water? Can we get medicine from our agricultural system? Can we get other materials like cooking oil? Things like that. And then finally, at the very top, we have cultural services. And cultural services are pretty much the services that come when people are living their best lives. Pretty much because we have food, we have water, we have shelter, we're able to live and survive and thrive. And when we're living and surviving and thriving, we're able to create recreation, go out and swim in the lake, go out and take a hike, go camping. This is recreation that we benefit from interacting with our environment. There's also the cultural aspect. Some people get spiritual and religious connections with the natural environment. And then, of course, building and spreading knowledge, where we use natural systems to better understand science and better understand living systems, as well as take classrooms out, science classrooms out to go and explore our natural ecosystems. So when we look at this triangle, and then when we look at our habitation systems we're developing, we really need to think about what in our habitation systems are supporting services, what in our habitation systems are regulating services, what are provisioning services, and what are cultural services. So just because supporting services are so important, I'm going to focus a little bit more into this area. So I mentioned that biogeochemical cycles are a supporting service. So this includes the nutrient cycle. So carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, all of your macro and micronutrients that are required by plants to survive. It's kind of the building blocks of life. It's food and nutrients. And then you have other biogeochemical cycles as well, your water cycle, your oxygen cycle, your rock cycle, etc. And a lot of these cycles, if not all of them, go through the soil. I'm a soil scientist, so I of course need to bring it up. Soil is this very interdisciplinary space where liquid, air, and solid matter all meet together. It's where a lot of chemistry happens, physics, geology, plant biology, microbiology. Soil systems are highly complicated systems, and it makes sense because all of these biological, geological, chemical cycles move through it and interact and make it possible for us to have the ecological systems that we have. So if you're thinking about having a field-based system or using the geology or soil of a place like Mars, you need to think about, are there biogeochemical cycles happening there, or do we need to better understand soil formation to understand how to start the water cycle, how to start the carbon cycle in our soil system? So it's important to kind of trace out where your biogeochemical cycles are. And if you're missing, for example, the water cycle, you should have water in your habitation system, of course, but to use it as an example, if you see that you're missing water, well, your plants need water, humans need water, you need water to clean things and to wash things. So obviously that needs to be there. So how can you cycle that through your system? So that's important to realize. And then of course, energetics are also part of the cycling. So the transfer and transformation of high energy organic molecules within ecological systems. A primary pathway of energetics is, of course, photosynthesis, taking the photons or light energy from the sun and having plants process it through photosynthesis. So there's a lot of primary pathways, but then we get into more system level pathways. And this can get very complicated very quickly. But let's say a good way to measure your energy flow in your system is to look at your net primary production, your harvest index. So net primary production is the total new biomass produced by plants in the system. So you have your agricultural system or your ecological system, and it's producing a bunch of biological mass, plant material. And then you have your harvest index, which is the ratio of the plant usable by humans to total dry organic matter. So to give an example, the plant usable by humans for, let's say, a corn plant is the corn kernels. So the kernels that you either pop into popcorn or that you eat directly off the cob. That's usable by humans. And then the rest of the plant, which includes the rest of the cob, and then the stem, the leaves, all the other parts, the root system, is the rest of your total organic matter. So to get your harvest index, which again is the ratio of the plant usable by humans to the total dry organic matter, you do dry mass of, i.e. corn kernels, divided by the mass of the entire corn plant dried out, times 100% equals your harvest index. So that's telling you how much of your system is producing plant matter that can be eaten by humans. So that can be an important number to know. And then there's this idea of resource and energy conservation. So you just don't want your energy to dissipate into space. Energy is so precious, especially if you're on Mars. So you want to conserve as much of your energy and resources as possible so you don't have to rely on supply chains, so that you don't have to have an unstable system. So examples of resource and energy conservation include composting organic matter waste, using manure or human feces as a fertilizer, water retention, gray water recycling, things like that. So to go a little bit more into this resource and energy conservation, this gets into the idea of what is called circular economy. And circular economy is a system of reuse, recycle, reduce, retain, and regeneration. So the 5 R's. So we have these 5 R's where we are taking materials or products and efficiently managing them. So we have, for example, raw materials go into our system. They go through production and are made so that we can consume them. And then you have all these waste products come out. And do these waste products go into a landfill? Do they get burned? Do they just contaminate the local environment? Or is there a better way to manage them so that instead of just losing those waste materials, they become a resource that you then reintegrate into your system? So to provide an example of this very idea, let's look at composting. So composting is the conversion of organic materials into nutrient-rich soil amendment through the process of decomposition. So we have plant material come into our system. We have processing of that plant material into oil, food, medicine, whatever we're processing it for. And then we have consumption and use of that plant material. And then we end up having parts of the plant we can't eat, or we didn't eat all of our food, so we have food scraps, or we just generate a bunch of waste with our organics. So instead of throwing those into a landfill, into the trash, and just losing them in space, why don't we bring them back into the system by composting them? So we create a compost system, we take the food scraps and put those in there. And there's a lot that goes into this, so I'm keeping it pretty simple. And over time, those food scraps will decompose into a very nutrient-rich organic substance that can be added back into your agricultural system as nutrients. So it's a natural fertilizer. So instead of losing those nutrients through the trash, we're recircularizing it into our system. So when we're thinking about our habitation systems, think about what are our waste streams and can we retain, recycle, regenerate those waste products into actual resources that come back into our system. And so when it comes to especially recycling, retaining nutrients, biodiversity becomes very important. So biodiversity is the variety of life in all its forms and combinations at all levels of organization. And so when we're thinking about having a biodiversity of nutrients, because we don't want to just eat potatoes, we want to eat a lot of the different fruits that we have here on Earth. We want to have variety in our diets. We want our plants to have a variety of nutrients. We need to think about biodiversity. So we need to think about, can our systems support more than just one species of plants? Can it support a variety of plant species so that we can get the calories that we need, so that we can get the nutrients that we need? And this biodiversity also helps with the stability and resilience of our system. And a good example to show this is when we look at bananas. So bananas are grown in monoculture systems, which means you just have banana trees growing in the system. You don't have any other plant species growing with them. And banana plantations are actually created through cloning the banana. So usually, if you go to the store and get a banana, you're probably eating the same banana. It's been cloned. So what makes this dangerous and this lack of biodiversity dangerous is that, for example, with the Cavendish banana, this fungus came in and almost wiped out the entire species. So this is how extinction of a species can happen. If you do not have biodiversity or genetic diversity of a species in your system, and a pest or a fungus or a virus comes in and that plant is very susceptible to it, it will spread so quickly through your system and kill everything off. So by having a biodiversity of plant species, it prevents massive die-off from happening. The virus may come in and affect this particular species, but this species over here isn't susceptible to it. So it doesn't actually get harmed by this virus. And so you're able to retain that species. So that's important to consider as well. You want an ecological system that supports a biodiversity of plant species, microbial species, other fauna as well. And so with biodiversity also comes this idea of redundancy. So you don't, for example, if you just are growing peas, well, peas provide the function of working with bacteria to fix nitrogen. It takes nitrogen gas enters the soil, and it goes through this process of then coming out as nitrates, and the plants can take up this nitrogen as a nutrient. It becomes bioavailable to them. So what if you have a virus come in and it wipes out your pea species because you were only growing pea species? Well, that function of processing nitrogen is now gone. How are you going to process nitrogen? Well, if you have this functional redundancy in your system, which is a common practice of engineering systems, and of course is a natural process in ecological systems where you don't just have a pea species fixing nitrogen, but you also have other vegetable legume species, such as soybeans or clover or alfalfa, that are doing the same function. So if your pea species are wiped out, well, you still have clover, you still have soybeans performing the function of nitrogen fixation. So you still have nitrogen as a part of your biogeochemical cycle going through. So you need to think about, when we're thinking about the multiple functions that a plant can have, is there another plant in your system that is doing a similar or the same function, so that if one plant is taken out, the other one is still supporting that function or service? And ultimately, all of these key environmental principles and ideas that we've been talking about help bring us to this idea of food security. And food security, as defined by the FAO, is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So when we're thinking about our habitation systems, we need to achieve food security. As we see here on Earth, there are many communities around the world that are food insecure, where they do not have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And so it's a huge challenge. Even here on Earth, we have this problem. So how can we achieve food security in space? And one way to think about this is to think about the dimensions of food security. So availability. Is there physical, are there plants growing at your location? Is food actively available? Is your ecological system or habitation system able to support the growth of food? So that's availability. Access. Do people or community members that live in that area, do they have social and economic access to that? Can they go and actually get that food to consume it? Or is there some kind of barrier in the way? Either it's too expensive so they can't access it, or the agricultural system is just too far away that they just can't get access to it. Utilization. If you have a food item that requires an oven or requires some kind of processing, is there technology, food storage processes in place that allow us to process and utilize food items? So some plants you can just pull out of the ground and eat right there, like a carrot, but other things might need a bit of processing before you can eat it. So can community members in your habitation system actually use those plants, or do they need other systems in place to process those plants so they can eat them or use them in a different way? Stability. So is your system actually stable? This can be ecologically stable, like is your ecological system able to continuously produce food? And if something were to happen, like a virus come in, it's not going to be completely turned on its head and not go well. So we have to think about how can we stabilize or create a stronger system where we can support food security. And then agency and sustainability. Agency being, do the community members in your habitation system here on Earth, do they have the agency and freedom to eat the food that they want, to have access to the food that they want, to have a say in what food they have access to? So that gets into agency. And then sustainability is, of course, always continuously at all times having access to food, which again, sustainability is ultimately built on the other dimensions. For a system to be sustainable, the food has to be available, there needs to be access, utilization needs to be possible, the system needs to be stable, and people need to have agency. So to finish off, I know I'm a little bit over. The takeaways for my talk are Earth agriculture and space agriculture have similar challenges in the realms of extreme environment exposure, human needs, food security, isolated communities, and soil and agriculture management. This opens opportunities for cross-industry collaboration and research and business. So when you're looking at your habitation systems, think about what you can learn from Earth agriculture. Are there potential collaborators or people you can talk to here on Earth that can help you think of creative ideas for your habitation system in space? 2, to develop an agroecological system that allows for human and ecosystem adaptability and resiliency, we need to understand what agroecological systems provide for humans beyond food. And this goes back into ecological services and food security. Our ecological systems don't only provide food to us, they provide oxygen, they provide recreation, psychological benefits, they provide our ability to live and thrive and have good lives. So think about plants as more than just food. 3, we need to address sustainable development and management of space agricultural systems, as we do not and should not repeat the same mistakes we have made with agricultural systems here on Earth. So our agricultural systems here on Earth are not perfect. They are definitely not perfect. There's a lot of horrible history with our agricultural systems, as well as amazing history with our agricultural systems. And right now we are living with some of the consequences of the mistakes and things that have happened in our agricultural industry. And so we need to make sure that when we go off into space, that we learn from those lessons and make sure we don't repeat those same problems, but take the ideas and innovation and knowledge that has been built on by indigenous communities, by people working in agriculture, farmers, scientists, everyone, to be able to develop systems that can do well in space, so that we can have a presence in space, so that we can be able to explore places like Mars and better understand our solar system and our universe. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Wonderful. I do have a few questions coming in from the students, and students, please continue to add your questions to the chat, or you can raise your Zoom hand and unmute yourself when you're called on. From Mena has a couple of questions. How many types of plants have been proven that they can grow outside Earth in extraterrestrial regolith, in good use of regolith, Mena?
So I don't know off the top of my head, but there have definitely been a variety of plants grown on the International Space Station for research reasons. So there are plant scientists, horticulturalists who actively do plant research on the International Space Station. So sometimes you use model species like Arabidopsis, which you can't eat, but it allows us to gain some fundamental biological principles and science that then allows us to be able to grow other plants in space, such as tomatoes or other food items. So there have definitely been a bunch of different species, and you should look into the research on that. You can definitely find news articles as well as papers on this.
And there's probably a Wikipedia page.
That too.
Thank you. Okay, and Mena also would like to know, what are the top major challenges in space ecology research?
Good question. So it may be different for each ecologist that you talk to and each biologist that you talk to. I would say, as someone who's been working in this field for the last 9 years, that some of the top challenges that I see is understanding how to use the local in situ resources like regolith as a potential soil media to grow plants. There hasn't been too much research. There's been some, but there's still so many open questions with that. And when we think back on the reality that like 95% of our food here on Earth comes from the soil, it seems like considering using Martian regolith will become so important. And so that's a major challenge right now, is how do we actually utilize the soil or the regolith of other planets, as well as continuing to study the growth of plants in varying gravity environments, because there's just so much that we still don't know. And that's kind of the reality of science and why science is always moving forward, because there's so much we still don't know. There's always questions to ask. So I would say soil use of the soil, and then better understanding how plants interact with and are affected by, especially the gravity environment.
And Alex has a question about gravity, and a couple of questions, but I'll ask you the gravity one first. How will the low gravity of space affect the plants?
Good question. It can affect how fluids move through the plants. So as we know, water moves through the plants, nutrients move through the plants from the roots up the stem to the leaves and vice versa. So that may affect what parts of the plants are getting the nutrients and fluids that they need, and how, i.e., how tall the plant can grow. If it grows really tall, that will be affected by, can the plant actually pull the water up or bring it back down? So fluid dynamics will be affected. The way that roots grow in a hydroponic system or even in a soil system. There is some really cool research that's been done on the International Space Station to see how plant roots respond to gravity, and things that we had assumed were like the chemical indicators for plants responding to gravity may not actually be what are responding to gravity. So that's why doing this research in varying degrees of gravity becomes so important, because sometimes we have assumptions in our head about, oh yeah, it works like this here on Earth, so it should work in space, or it might be the opposite. But until we actually take plants into differing gravity environments, then we can just have questions and just have assumptions. So we need some hard-hitting data to know how low gravity will affect plants.
Great answer. Alex also wants to know, how will we pollinate plants in space?
So pollination, yes, it's a good question, because bees are commonly used for pollination. So can insects survive in a lower gravity environment? And can you create a home or habitat for them? So when you bring insects into the equation, it's like, well, bees like hives. So do you have the materials in place to support the creation of a hive? And do you have enough plants available so that they can have the pollen that they need to support a hive and thus to propagate, because that's also how they have babies. So pollination is not only about plants, it's about the species that also help with the plants and all their needs as well. Of course, there are plant species that use wind pollination as well. So you might have some fans in its most basic level, you have fans going through your habitation system just to push the pollen into the air so that it can travel to the other plants. The more difficult pollination method, which I have done as a researcher before, is hand pollination, where you take a little Q-tip and you get the pollen off of one plant and you put it with another plant. We want to avoid that because it's so time intensive. So we need to think about how we can have natural solutions for the pollination question.
And I believe bees use the magnetic field of Earth to
Yes.
figure where they're going, and that will be an extra added challenge.
Yes, it will be. So
So maybe
planetary
manual
scale
at
stuff.
first.
Yep.
Lucky for the scientists. Alex has another question about solar panels. Yes, we'll use solar panels on Mars. And he wants to know if we will, and yes. If so, will the smaller sun affect the energy produced by the solar panels? Well, being further away, I think is what he means. Yes, it will.
Yeah.
So there's a
Yep,
whole
we are all in agreement. Yes.
there's a whole equation for that, Alex. If you
Yes.
need more info, email me and I will send that to you if you need help finding it. Good questions. Ahmed would like to know, is there any type of algae or plant that can tolerate the Martian environment and adapt to its soil so it can live on it?
Yeah, and this is where it becomes important to look at ecosystems here on Earth that have similarities to Mars. So we're talking about places with differences in atmospheric pressure. So up higher on mountains that have lower atmospheric pressure, there are plants growing there that are able to live in those extreme environments. So we should be looking at these locations. Like, it would be really cool to have a collaboration with communities in the Andes Mountains of South America, because the people who live there know that environment really well and they know their ecological system very well. So there could be varieties of plants that would be great to bring with us into space. And then, of course, what you're specifically talking about is more the microbial algae side of things. So let's look at systems that are extreme, like hot springs, where there are specialized kinds of algae and microbiology that live in these environments that are extremely hot or extremely acidic, that have these adaptations that allow them to survive these conditions. Those could be very interesting to study, to bring into space as well. I know a colleague of mine looks at these particular bacteria that react with UV radiation and become very fluorescent. They change color when they interact with UV radiation, and it kind of helps them protect themselves from the potential damages that UV radiation can have. So there's definitely environments that we can look on here at Earth to find potential species that would do well in these environments.
And James, you may have already addressed this question in part. He would like to know, what's the most challenging part of growing plants in the space station and on Mars? I think you addressed some of it.
Yeah, so it's definitely, a lot of it comes back to those supporting services that we talked about, the ecological services, where the plants that we'll be bringing with us have evolved within the context of Earth. They've evolved within the context of our gravity system here, within the particular environmental parameters of this ecological system they're based in. And so when we bring them into a potentially different environment where we're no longer meeting those parameters, they might die off. So you might expect a mass extinction to happen with the plants that you bring if they're not adapted to that system. And that goes back to the previous question of, are there plants that we can use that already have some adaptations in place from them growing in already extreme environments? And then we can also consider genetic engineering as well. Is there a way for us to genetically engineer plants so that they can survive in these environments? And genetic engineering is pretty much a shortened timestamp for breeding. So plant breeding, where we're propagating plants with, ooh, this plant has this feature that we really like, and this plant has this feature that we really like. Let's bring them together, propagate them, and then their children or their progeny kind of have the phenotype of the two. Genetic engineering just allows us to shorten the process of breeding over multiple generations. So there could be genetic engineering in place, and that has been used to help in locations that have undergone like major food insecurity due to pests going through, or just other disruptions in ecological systems. So genetic engineering, and then of course the question of your regolith or your soil, and being able to create an environment for the roots of the plant that allows it to survive, that allows it to get all the nutrients it needs. So even with a hydroponic system, you're putting a nutrient solution through it. So it's getting the nutrients that it needs. Of course, you're going to have to restock those nutrients. So are you getting those nutrients from back on Earth? That's a 9-month journey away. What if the supply chain gets cut off due to another pandemic on Earth? So is there a way for you to create those nutrients on site so that you can have a continuous supply of nutrients in your hydroponic system? With a soil system, it creates kind of a substrate for you to continuously have a nutrient supply, because you get nutrients from the mineralogy. And then if you do composting or a circular economy like we were talking about, then you can reintroduce nutrients into your soil, and they can be held in place and continuously provide fertility to your soil. So there's different things to consider when it comes to challenges. I definitely encourage you to continue to read papers and look into this.
It's a very complex subject, like it's complex. There's not one answer, right? There's a lot of factors. So great explanation. All right, Tim would like to know, speaking of hydroponics, which do you think is more useful as an alternative to soil for Mars, hydroponics or aquaponics?
Good question. With aquaponics, you're bringing in fish and other potential sea creatures, which of course are going to provide nutrients into your system. So that could help solve some of that nutrient question that we had before. And then of course, your fish or your shrimp or whatever you're growing in the system could then also become a food source, as long as they're able to propagate successfully. So I can't say for sure, because I think what becomes important is we need to test these systems more here on Earth, and as well as in simulated environments, to really understand if these systems will provide us with what we need, and if they can even work or function in these kinds of environments.
Okay, and Alex, last question. How would you water plants in space?
Oh, NASA's still trying to figure this one out, because a lot of this is physics and ecological thermodynamics. So environmental science is very much a field that brings all of the disciplines together. It's very multidisciplinary. So when it comes to water, this is also my own research. I've sent soil into space. So I'm thinking about the water dynamics in my soil systems that I sent up to the International Space Station. And it's so complicated, because when you are, in that case, in a free fall environment, which is low Earth orbit, if you've seen the astronauts like wring the towel and the water just sticks to their hands and doesn't fall. Well, when we think about pipes, the water just pools along the edges of the pipe, and you actually have a hole through the middle that's filled with air. So it's like, and it wants to kind of stay in place, but you have to like put pressure behind it. So like a false gravity, or a fake gravity, you need to put pressure behind it, or a sucking motion, to move that water through your system. And
Like
so,
a pneumatic tube or something?
yeah. So hydroponic systems will be affected by that, as well as soil systems, because soil systems have all of their pores. So they're like all these mini pipes throughout the soil, which complicates things more. So yeah, it's a very good question and still very much being researched.
Okay, thank you so very much for your time, Morgan. I'm sure if any students have direct questions for you, you wouldn't mind if we forwarded them. And to any of the speakers, you guys can ask me and I can forward it if you have particular questions. I really appreciate it. This recording will be uploaded on YouTube in the next day or two. So you can share, widely if you like. Thank you so very much to you and to Lee and to all of our speakers and everyone in the US. Have a wonderful and safe holiday. And I will see everyone on Wednesday. So enjoy the break and please email me with any questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
All the thank yous are coming in the chat. Bye. Have a great day.